Is having facial hair on men a biblical issue? Let's get into it right here on Keeping It in Context. Now, some might ask, why is having facial hair on men within Christianity even an issue at all, right? Well, it's not really an issue for most men within Christianity today, but at different times throughout church history and in some small denominational groups within Christianity over the recent years have in fact made facial hair on men an issue. For example, in 195 AD, Clement of Alexandria called beards the mark of a man and said it is therefore unholy to desecrate the symbol of manhood. In 411 AD, Euthemius, who was a monastic and a venerated saint in the Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, said, "Only men with a beard can enter his Judean desert monastery, not boys with female faces." In 1031, the Roman Church had actually banned the wearing of beards, and in 1054, the Byzantine Christians were partially excommunicated for growing beards by the Roman Church. In the denominational organization that I was formerly a part of for many years called the United Pentecostal Church International, men being allowed to have facial hair, especially in ministry, was a major or serious issue from the 1960s up until today. It's kind of being more relaxed now in certain pockets within the organization, but it still is for many a measuring stick to determine one's level of holiness or submission to God. When you look at other similar organizations like the United Pentecostal Church, if one does not really believe how facial hair is to be taught, or if one decides to keep their facial hair, even if one leaves those local churches, they are often looked at or labeled as carnal, as either backslidden, rebellious, or just simply prideful. Even if one is newly converted, they are expected at some point soon to shave off their facial hair. Now, the question is why, right? Why did this mindset and standard of prohibiting facial hair on men in these groups or throughout church history become such a foundational rule? Well, it simply has to do with the specific cultures of the day and the opinions and perspectives of what the majority thought beards represented at the time. Take, for example, the countercultural shifts of the 1950s and 60s in America. Due to America's war involvement in Vietnam, along with the widespread enjoyment of recreational drugs and sex and free-spirited music and communal living, and a desire for harmonization with nature and Eastern religions, specific movements such as the beatniks, who later turned into the hippies, who for the most part were middle-class Caucasian Americans, were birthed. And from out of these movements came specific fashionable trends, such as, but not limited to, colorful clothing, sandals, bell-bottom jeans, long skirts and little to no makeup on women, long hair on men and women, and goatees and beards on men. Now, during the 1940s, goatees and beards were not really a fashionable trend, but rather a clean-shaven, well-groomed appearance. And since the hippies were a countercultural movement, one of the ways to display that in men was to not shave or to be fully groomed, hence the resurgence of goatees and beards. But since organizations such as the UPC, which was ironically formed in the 1940s, had held strongly to that 1940s kind of look as a moral identity for men and viewed the growing of beards as just a sign of rebellion and societal norms, when hippie men decided to turn their lives to Christ, one of the important requirements that they instituted was to have all of the men shave their facial hair. Now, while it seemed at the time to be a reasonable attempt to remove the outward appearance of what was considered to be an old rebellious lifestyle, as time progressed, it became law for many of those churches, and it was preached to never change even if the culture throughout the years would. Sermons and church policies and books were written to influence facial hair prohibitions, and many times if men or churches did not adhere, they would receive sharp rebukes or even disfellowship. In a 2014 article written by a Pentecostal evangelist and staunch supporter against facial hair named Martin Ballestero, entitled "I Don't Like Facial Hair on Pentecostal Men," he makes these particular statements. Now, after a half a century or so of no facial hair on men in mainstream Pentecost, it has started appearing again. Why? What changed in their minds, and why did it change? He says, recently a Pentecostal organization even passed a position paper making it acceptable in their ranks for men to wear facial hair. Was the change made to appease liberals? Was it made to make the church look more like the world? Was it done to win the world? How does this help identify us as apostolic? If you're not wearing it out of compromise, rebellion, or from a backslidden state, and you're wearing it just because you think it looks good on you, then would you say it is a pride issue with you? Clearly, in this gentleman's view, the desire for wearing facial hair on Pentecostal men was, and still is, an underlying manifestation of worldliness and pride, and does not reflect the identity of his particular denomination. But with all that being said, let's look at the scriptures now and let's see what the biblical view is on facial hair and whether or not such tension is even necessary. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 27. It reads, "And you shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard." In 2 Samuel chapter 10 and starting in verse 4, it reads, "Therefore Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half of their beards, cut off their garments in the middle at their buttocks, and sent them away. When they told David, he sent to meet them because the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, 'Wait at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return.'" In 2 Samuel chapter 19 and verse 24 says, "Now Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, and he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he returned in peace." And Ezra chapter 9 and verse 3 says, "So when I heard this thing, I tore my garment and my robe and plucked out some of the hair of my head and beard and sat down astonished." In Psalm chapter 133 and verse 1, "Behold, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious oil upon the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the edge of his garments." And even when it comes to the Lord Jesus Christ, in Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6, which is a prophecy of Jesus, it says, "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting." Now, these are just a few scriptures to point out. There's many others, but as you can already see from the ones we just presented, shows that having facial hair on men is something that was favorable. It was something that's common and acceptable. And furthermore, there's different instances where beards were either trimmed, shaven, plucked, or not even cut at all. And it all happened for specific reasons. In order, for example, to prevent the men of Israel from mimicking the facial hair cutting styles that were connected in pagan worship among the other nations surrounding them, God commanded them to refrain from shaving or cutting their facial hair in those particular manners. When it came to the men showing a sign of mourning, like in Ezra chapter 9 and verse 3, like we read, or to show that one had recovered from the disease called leprosy, men were allowed by God to shave or pluck out their beards. In Leviticus chapter 14 and verse 8, it says, "He who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. And after that he shall come into the camp and shall stay outside his tent 7 days. But on the 7th day he shall shave all the hair off his head and his beard and his eyebrows. All his hair he shall shave off. He shall wash his clothes and wash his body in water, and he shall be clean." When it came to men who took a Nazirite vow, God commanded them to never cut their hair or beards until their Nazirite vow was fulfilled. And when men wanted to take away the dignity of other men, like in the case of 2 Samuel chapter 10, shaving one's beard was the means of doing so. So these examples and many others that were not mentioned shows us that facial hair on men was common, acceptable, and served a positive purpose. And even when you look at the writings of the New Testament, no specific issue of men wearing facial hair was ever raised. In fact, the Apostle Paul makes it clear that any particular issue like these should be determined by one's moral conviction, as mentioned in Romans chapter 14, which I think it would be good for everyone to read. One verse I would point out is in verse 22. The verse says, "Do you have faith? Have it to yourselves before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves." In other words, if wearing facial hair, for example, is not an issue for you, then you are within your moral rights in God's eyes to have it. You don't have to feel condemnation about it, or you don't have to feel condemnation by others who may oppose it. And so when it comes to facial hair on men, if there are no biblical concerns, regardless if it fits the norms of the culture or not, making it an established law that should never change, or prohibiting men from participating in the work of God, or even making it a measuring stick to determine one's spiritual condition or eternal destination, is simply nonsensical and is a form of legalism of which Jesus came to destroy. Furthermore, having facial hair for men is actually a natural God-given feature that helps to clarify the distinction between a male and a female. Now, if God made men with the natural ability to grow facial hair to express the distinction between the sexes, I find it extremely strange and contradictory to then condemn men for wearing what was naturally given to him by God in the first place. Well, that's it for this video. I hope it was a blessing. If you found the content to be worthwhile, please like, share this content, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell for future videos. And you can also leave comments if you would like. And of course, as always, as you go back to study the word, just remember to remind yourself that as I'm studying the word, I got to make sure I keep everything in context.